Elliot had never noticed how often his sister said the exact same thing. It was Saturday morning, and they were sitting in the kitchen, eating toast. She smiled, butter knife in hand, and said, "You know, mornings are the best time for thinking." 5 minutes later, after checking her phone, she looked up, smiled the same way, and said, "You know, mornings are the best time for thinking." Same cadence, same pause after "you know." Even the same small flicker in her eyes, like she was hitting play on a recording. Elliot laughed awkwardly. "You just said that." She tilted her head, expression flat for a fraction of a second too long. Then she chuckled, too loud, too crisp, and reached for another slice of toast. It should have been nothing, but the sound of her laugh stayed with him the rest of the day, like a clock ticking in the back of his skull. That night, Elliot went over to his friend Aaron's place for beer and pizza. Aaron had been his best friend since college. Easygoing, quick with a joke. They were halfway through a game on TV when Elliot mentioned the weird thing his sister had done. Aaron laughed, but then didn't. The laugh froze mid-breath. His mouth stayed open just a fraction too long, eyes locked forward, like a paused video. Elliot stared, the noise of the TV filling the room. Then Aaron blinked twice in rapid succession, finished the laugh, and asked, "You want another beer?" Like nothing had happened. Elliot mumbled something and sat back. On the table, the condensation from Aaron's beer bottle traced a perfect circle, absolutely perfect, like it had been drawn with a compass. The next morning, Elliot called his mother. She answered on the second ring, cheerful as always. "Hi, sweetheart. How's my favorite boy?" They chatted about small things, the weather, his work, until Elliot mentioned he hadn't been sleeping well. There was a pause. Not a natural one, but a hollow, airless silence, as if the line had gone dead. Then she spoke again, but her voice sounded slightly different. The pitch was the same, but the rhythm was off, words landing with mechanical precision. "Have you tried drinking warm milk before bed?" she asked. The suggestion was so cliché, so unlike her usual practical advice, that Elliot almost laughed. But before he could answer, she repeated it. Exactly the same sentence, same tone, same micropause before milk. When the call ended, Elliot realized the line had never once crackled, dipped, or wavered. It had been unnaturally clean, like a pre-recorded track. On his way to work, Elliot stopped at a busy crosswalk. The "Don't Walk" sign was red, and a small crowd waited beside him. He noticed a man in a gray coat standing just to his right. The man's head turned slowly, too slowly, until his gaze was fixed on Elliot. Then, without changing his expression, the man raised his hand in a mechanical wave. Elliot gave an awkward nod. That's when he saw it, a woman across the street, mid-step, suddenly freeze. Not stumble, not hesitate. Freeze completely, like time had stopped for her. The gray-coated man lowered his hand, and the woman immediately resumed walking, her legs catching up with her momentum as if nothing had happened. When the light turned green, Elliot crossed with the others, trying not to look back. But in the glass reflection of a store window, he swore the gray-coated man's mouth was moving silently, shaping words Elliot couldn't hear. That night, Elliot dug out an old spiral notebook from his desk. He wrote Saturday. Sarah repeats exact phrase twice. Below that, Sunday, Aaron freezes mid-laugh. Then, Monday, Mom repeats sentence, exact inflection. And finally, Tuesday, crosswalk freeze, gray coat watching. He stared at the list, the dates lining up neatly like coordinates. His hand hovered before adding a new line. Patterns? Just then, his phone buzzed. It was a text from Aaron. "Hey, you busy? We should hang out soon." He started to type a reply but stopped when he noticed the timestamp. 8:03 p.m. Exactly the same minute Aaron had texted him the last 3 times. He checked the message history to be sure. And each text had been exactly 5 words long. Elliot closed the notebook slowly, as if covering a secret. Elliot decided to try something small. The next day, he met his sister for coffee. She was cheerful, sipping her latte, stirring it with slow, deliberate circles. "You know," she began, "mornings are the best time for thinking." Elliot finished for her. She stopped stirring. Her smile froze in place, spoon suspended midair. For a long moment, her eyes didn't blink. Then she laughed. But it wasn't a normal laugh. It was sharp, abrupt, like a sound effect dropped into a conversation. "You're so predictable," she said, voice a touch too bright. Elliot forced a smile. The spoon in her cup hadn't moved once since she froze, yet the coffee was still swirling. Elliot went to the grocery store that evening, hoping mundane errands would calm him down. But in the produce section, he noticed something wrong. A woman in a red sweater was examining apples. Her hand moved from one to another, squeezing them in perfect intervals, exactly 3 seconds apart. 1 squeeze, 2 squeeze, 3 squeeze, over and over, without variation. He moved to another aisle. There, a man stood staring at a box of cereal, his lips moving faintly. Elliot inched closer. The man was repeating the same 3 words under his breath. All is well. All is well. All is well. Elliot's stomach tightened. He left without buying anything. As the sliding doors closed behind him, he glanced back. The woman in the red sweater was standing perfectly still, apple in hand, staring directly at him. 2 days later, Elliot sat in a park, pretending to read while he watched the people around him. On a nearby bench, Aaron and Sarah sat side by side, facing the pond. Neither of them was speaking, but their heads tilted in small, precise movements, Sarah to the left, Aaron to the right, in perfect alternation, like a pendulum swinging. Every so often, their eyes would flick toward each other, then back to the pond. It looked like talking, not with words, but with some other system, something they didn't want him to hear. Elliot shifted slightly to get a better view. In the reflection on the water, he saw Aaron's mouth open just a crack, then close. The moment it did, Sarah's head gave the tiniest nod, as if she'd just heard him. The sound of a jogger's footfalls broke Elliot's focus. When he looked back at the bench, it was empty. Elliot chose Aaron. They met at a bar, the low lighting making it easier for Elliot to study him without being obvious. Halfway through their drinks, Elliot leaned in. What were you and Sarah talking about in the park? Aaron blinked once, too slow. We didn't see Sarah in the park. I watched you, Elliot said. You were moving your heads, like you were having a conversation. Aaron smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. You're imagining things. He took a sip of beer, then set the glass down. The liquid inside didn't ripple. Not a single bubble shifted, as if the drink were a solid object. Elliot stared at it until Aaron casually placed his hand over the glass. I think, Aaron said softly, you've been paying a little too much attention lately. That night, Elliot couldn't shake Aaron's words. He closed his blinds, locked his door, and tried to read in bed. Around midnight, a faint click drew his attention to the window. He pulled the blinds back just enough to peek outside. Across the street, in the second-floor window of an apartment building, a figure was standing perfectly still. No movement, no visible breathing, just a silhouette facing his apartment. Elliot stared for what felt like minutes. Then, without shifting its body, the figure's head turned directly toward him. He dropped the blinds and stepped back, pulse pounding. When he dared to look again, the window across the street was dark. In the silence, he thought he heard something faint, like the static between radio stations, coming from inside his own apartment. The sound was faint at first, like a whisper smothered under a blanket. Elliot followed it through his apartment, holding his breath. It grew louder near the kitchen. The radio on the counter, one he hadn't used in years, was on. The dial was set between stations, hissing with static. He reached for the knob to turn it off. The static cut out. Then, in a flat, mechanical voice, subject aware. Adjust behavior. Elliot stumbled backward, knocking over a chair. The radio went silent again, as if nothing had happened. From outside, faint footsteps echoed in the hallway, slow, measured, approaching his door. Elliot froze, listening. The footsteps stopped just outside his apartment. A soft knock followed, 3 evenly spaced taps. He crept to the peephole. His mother stood there, smiling faintly, hands folded in front of her. He didn't open the door. Mom, what are you doing here? Her lips moved, but there was no sound. Instead, from the radio in the kitchen, her voice came perfectly clear. Let me in, sweetheart. Elliot's mouth went dry. You're not supposed to be here. She tilted her head, still smiling. From behind her, down the hall, Aaron stepped into view, eyes fixed straight ahead, walking toward the door. Elliot backed away. The knock came again. 3 perfect taps. Elliot grabbed his keys and bolted for the back door, avoiding the front where his mother and Aaron waited. The stairwell was dim and smelled faintly of dust. He took the steps 2 at a time, trying not to think about how quiet it was, too quiet for an apartment building at night. Halfway down, he froze. A man stood on the landing below, hands clasped behind his back, staring up at Elliot without expression. The man didn't move, didn't blink. Then, in perfect unison, from every floor above and below, came the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, all moving toward him. Elliot turned and ran back up, heart pounding, but when he reached his floor and burst through the door, his apartment door was wide open. Elliot stood frozen in the hallway. The lights in his apartment were off, yet the darkness inside seemed thicker than it should have been, like it absorbed what little light spilled in from the hall. "Hello?" he called, his voice barely above a whisper. From somewhere deep inside, something shifted. Not footsteps, more like the sound of fabric stretching, slow and deliberate. Then, faintly, a familiar voice. Mornings are the best time for thinking. His sister's voice. But it came from the kitchen, and from the bedroom, and from right behind the couch, all at once. Elliot backed away, but the apartment seemed to breathe, walls subtly contracting and expanding as if the whole place were alive. A shadow moved inside. It wasn't shaped like any human he'd ever seen. Elliot's breath caught as the shadow slid forward, separating from the darkness. For a moment, it still looked vaguely human, his sister's height, her outline, until it stepped into the hall light. Her face was wrong, not deformed, just too smooth, like skin stretched over a mannequin's head. Where her eyes should have been were two dark, liquid shapes that shifted slowly, never blinking. She tilted her head, and the motion was disturbingly fluid, like a puppet on invisible strings. When she spoke, the sound didn't come from her mouth. It came from the walls, the floor, the very air. "You've been watching." From the corner of his vision, another figure emerged from the kitchen doorway. Aaron, his own face dissolving into that same smooth, featureless mask. And then, in unison, they took a step toward him. Elliot bolted, sprinting down the hallway, past doors that he suddenly realized were all slightly ajar. From each one, a head turned toward him. Neighbors he'd seen for years, now revealing the same smooth, shifting faces. They didn't chase. They only watched. It was worse than pursuit. He reached the stairwell again, but when he looked down, it wasn't the stairwell anymore, just a vertical shaft of black, deeper than any building should have. A whisper rose from it, dozens of voices layered together. "Come down, Elliot." He stumbled backward, heart pounding, and ran for the roof access instead. The metal door was warm to the touch, almost alive. When he shoved it open, a cold wind hit him, and every single person on the rooftop turned to face him at once. The rooftop was crowded, at least 30 people, standing in perfect rows. Neighbors, coworkers, people he'd passed on the street, all facing him, unmoving, their faces shifting between familiar features and that smooth, liquid nothingness. The wind carried no sound except a faint hum, low and resonant, vibrating in his bones. It was coming from them. Elliot stepped back toward the door, but it slammed shut behind him with a metallic finality. The crowd parted, opening a narrow path toward the center of the roof. There, a figure taller than the rest waited, its human disguise half peeled away, revealing something pale and jointed, its skin folding like paper over sharp, angular shapes. It raised a hand, too many fingers, bending wrong, and the hum stopped. The silence pressed in, almost suffocating. Then it spoke, voice like steel dragged across stone. "You are the last one." Elliot's throat tightened. "The last what?" The tall figure tilted its head, and the motion rippled down its body like a wave. "The last unbound," it said. "All others have been integrated." The word integrated made Elliot's skin crawl. Faces around him flickered between identities, his sister, his mother, strangers, before melting back to the blank, shifting form. "You watch too closely," the figure continued. "You see the errors." It stepped closer, joints clicking softly. "But now, you will be corrected." Elliot backed up until his heel met the roof's edge. Far below, the street was empty, too empty. No cars, no people, no sound. The others began moving toward him in perfect unison, steps matching like clockwork. Each one whispered a single word, over and over, until it became a chorus. "Integrate, integrate, integrate." Elliot's mind raced. He couldn't fight them, there were too many. But maybe he could break whatever was controlling them. He lunged toward the tall figure, shoving past two of the blank-faced things. In its half-peeled disguise, he could see a faint seam running along its neck, thin, pulsating, almost like a zipper. Without thinking, he grabbed it and yanked. The figure let out a piercing tone, not a scream, but a single sustained frequency that made Elliot's vision swim. The others froze mid-step, heads twitching erratically. Beneath the peeling disguise, something glistened, wet, jointed, insect-like, and for the first time, Elliot thought he saw fear in its shifting face. Then the sky above them rippled, as if the world itself had glitched. The ripple spread outward, warping the stars into smeared streaks of light. The rooftop, the city, everything wavered like a reflection in disturbed water. Elliot stumbled back, clutching the seam he'd torn. Through the distortion, he caught glimpses. Not buildings, not streets, but vast, metallic structures curving in impossible directions. A dim red horizon. Towers that breathed. The figures around him flickered wildly, their disguises stuttering between human shapes and the jointed, insect-like things beneath. "You've broken the frame," the tall one hissed, voice glitching. "This is not your world. It never was." The hum started again, deeper this time, and the ripple in the sky began to close, sealing away the alien landscape. If it closed completely, Elliot knew he'd never see it, or the truth, again. He had seconds to act. Elliot didn't think, he ran. The ripple in the sky pulsed like a living wound, edges folding inward. He sprinted across the rooftop, the crowd turning toward him in eerie unison. Hands reached out, fingers stretching longer than humanly possible, but he dove past them, leaping toward the largest distortion. For a split second, he felt nothing but cold, like falling into deep water. Then, impact. He hit solid ground, but it wasn't concrete. It was warm, faintly vibrating, and it curved beneath him like the inside of a shell. He looked up. The sky above was a translucent dome, beyond which enormous shapes moved. Hundreds of the insect-like beings, each as tall as a building, watching him with eyes that glowed faintly green. Behind him, the tear was closing. The tall figure's voice bled through. "You cannot exist here." Elliot scrambled to his feet, staring at the curved, organic floor beneath him. It pulsed faintly, in rhythm with a low, distant heartbeat that seemed to come from everywhere. One of the towering insect things stepped closer to the dome, its face pressing against the translucent barrier. A series of clicks echoed through the space, but somehow he understood them, not as words, but as meaning. "You are inside the vessel." Images burst into his mind, flashes of the city he'd lived in, revealed as a complex simulation projected into his brain. The buildings were nothing but textured walls inside this living ship. The people? Constructs, their forms shaped to keep him docile. "You were the last unprocessed consciousness," the meaning continued. "You have breached containment. This cannot remain." The heartbeat grew louder, shaking the ground. Somewhere, the tall figure from the rooftop was forcing its way through the narrowing tier. The tall figure emerged through the tear, its disguise now gone entirely, its limbs too many, its surface shimmering like oil and water. It moved toward him with a terrible elegance, each step vibrating through the living floor. The towering beings outside the dome clicked in unison, and the meaning poured into Elliot's mind again. Reintegrate the fragment. Remove the variance. He understood they were going to rewrite him. Erase whatever part of him had noticed the glitches, smooth over the questions, make him like the rest. The tall figure's many hands extended, each tipped with a fine, needle-like appendage. The dome above them began to darken, and he felt pressure building in his skull, like someone was trying to press a new set of thoughts inside. The worst part wasn't the pain. It was the creeping calm that came with it. A voice in his own head whispering, "You'll feel better when it's over." Elliot dropped to his knees, not in surrender, but to grab the seam in the floor. It wasn't solid. It flexed like muscle under his fingers. If this was a living ship, maybe he could hurt it. The tall figure loomed over him, needle limbs descending. Elliot dug his hands into the pulsing membrane and ripped. The floor convulsed, a shudder tearing through the vessel. The towering beings outside reeled back from the dome, their glowing eyes flaring. The pressure in his skull faltered. The needles stopped just inches from his face. From somewhere far below, a deafening roar echoed, deep and furious. The ship's heartbeat, turned frantic, and the tear in the sky above them began to rip open again, wider this time, showing not just the alien landscape, but an expanse of blinding stars beyond. The tall figure screamed, not a sound, but a vibration that made the world buckle. Elliot threw himself toward the widening breach. Elliot hurled himself through the breach, tumbling into the cold dark. Stars spun around him, vast and endless. For the first time, there was no hum, no heartbeat, just silence. Something caught him. Not hands, something invisible, like the pull of a tide. The stars shifted, folding inward, until they formed a single glowing aperture ahead. A voice, not alien, but human, spoke inside his mind. Simulation breach contained. Subject returned to baseline. The light swallowed him whole. Elliot blinked and found himself back in his apartment, sitting at the kitchen table. His sister sat across from him, smiling, butter knife in hand. "You know," she said, "mornings are the best time for thinking." He opened his mouth to speak and realized he didn't remember why that phrase felt wrong.